on this really quickly. Let's bring into the conversation right now as we await for this. We'll take you out to these remarks, but let's be joined right now by the AP reporter there covering all things around this, by Will Weissert, friend of the program. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Real quickly, as we wait for the motorcade, can you talk about the impact of this ceasefire deal? It's a major breakthrough in terms of this region. What do we expect to see over the next day or so?
Well, it is a major breakthrough. Potentially, the first step is the release of hostages within 48 hours. That's part of the reason why President Trump is going there personally, to try and make sure that that happens. As you noted, it is a first phase. There's more to this deal, but this is an important first step. And if this holds, the administration and the president himself really see this as a chance to sort of remake the region and maybe, greatly improve Israel's standing with sort of Arab nations and build a larger peace that could last beyond this. Those are all goals that he's talked about over the last couple of months. It looks like they're sort of within striking distance now, but there's still a lot that can go wrong as well. And that's why the next 48 hours are sort of so key.
Yeah, so very crucial. And we'll stick with this real quickly. We see the beast arriving right now. We will expect to get some questions. I'm going to dive out to this. We'll hang with us for just the time being, as potentially we could hear from President Trump arriving at Joint Base Andrews. You can see this angle right there. It's on the opposite end. You can see Susie Wiles there, the chief of staff, inside, I believe, alongside him, as it's a rainy, kind of cloudy day in our nation's capital. This is a big trip. Phase number one, the hostages will be released. We also have this shot from a different angle, as we will hopefully hear some remarks. President Trump likely to speak to the media about this trip. There's going to be other subjects likely to be asked about this, but we haven't heard from him this weekend. This is going to be a big trip. Him stepping out, taking the umbrella, potentially walking over to the media to answer some quick questions ahead of this trip to the Mideast. Let's listen in.
A lot of my friends. This is going to be a good one. So this is going to be a very special time, and I guess if you read your own papers and your own networks, everybody's very excited about this moment in time. So I'll see you on the plane. I think you're traveling with us, but this is a very special event. They had 500,000 people yesterday and today in Israel, and also the Muslim and Arab countries are all cheering. Everybody's cheering at one time. That's never happened before. Usually if you have one cheering, the other isn't. The other is the opposite. This is the first time everybody is amazed and they're thrilled, and it's an honor to be involved. And we're going to have an amazing time, and it's going to be something that's never happened before. So I'll see you on the plane, and we're going to have a good time. Okay, Peter? Nice to see you. Thank you, everybody. See you in a little while.
Thank you, sir. Is the war in Gaza over?
All right, just listening in there real briefly, as there might be a gaggle aboard Air Force One. You can see him holding pretty tightly to that umbrella at this point. Kind of a windy, gusty, rainy day there at Joint Base Andrews, boarding Air Force One to head to Israel first. Tel Aviv is expected to speak to the Knesset, and then also off to Egypt, as he mentioned just kind of the impact of both Arab countries, but also in Israel as well, the impacts of this. So you can see him there stepping onto Air Force One at this moment. We'll keep an eye on it as it goes wheels up. Let's bring back in, though, Will Weissert with the Associated Press. We were just talking about this is just phase one, but a big step there. He's expected to speak, meet with hostages' families, speak at the Knesset. What could we expect from those remarks?
I think he's going to strike a very positive tone. Obviously, he has talked about, members of the administration have talked about how this is still precarious and it could sort of fall apart. But assuming that phase one goes the way that they hope it will and think it will, I expect him to strike a very, very positive tone and to say, that he's been able to sort of bring to an end a conflict that, his predecessor, Joe Biden, was not able to do. And this is another example of his personally intervening and helping find peace in a conflict. And how I was saying before about this could be a sort of a building block towards a larger sort of peace process throughout the region. Those are all, positive things. Obviously, how this will play out it remains to be seen. And there's a lot of still very complicated issues that will sort of need to resolve themselves. But we also sort of expect that the audience will be, quite positive. Not everybody loves this deal and sort of what Israel, might potentially have to give up in terms of prisoner releases and other things to make it a reality. But they generally, many in the Netanyahu coalition have been quite positive towards Trump, and we're expecting, his words to be sort of very well received there.
And you mentioned, we talk about it, phase one of the ceasefire deal. We have this 20-point plan that was laid, the groundwork, the blueprint by this Trump administration, and some of those 20 points not making up of this phase one, including that disarmament portion of this. You heard a reporter ask President Trump as he was boarding Air Force One, is there peace in the Middle East? Is this a true ceasefire? How fragile is this at this moment? There's still a long way from going to the so-called finish line, correct?
Right. I mean, I think it still is very fragile. We've talked about phase one and the hostage release, there'll be prisoner releases. The negotiations will continue to be ongoing. But we've been here before. I mean, there have been ceasefires before. President Trump sort of talks about how this is historic and it's never been done before. Well, we had a couple during the Biden administration as well, and they didn't hold. There's some reason to believe, given the 20 points that have been laid out and, the sort of positive feedback from many different people in the regions of different sides so far, that this could have a more lasting impact, but we're honestly not there yet. And we really won't know until we get deeper down the line exactly what the outcome will be. Now, I don't expect any of that to dampen, President Trump's mood. I mean, he's going to talk about, bringing peace to the Middle East. He might even mention the Nobel Prize, right? And how he didn't get it before he might have been nominated, after the decision. Well, this process might have happened, we should say, after the decision had, already been made. But I do think that will, not stop him at all from sort of declaring victory, even if the sort of reality is a little bit more precarious.
Yeah, and there's always potentially next year for that, not out of the running as of yet. So if this does hold, and obviously that is kind of contentious, if it does hold, potentially up for it in a year's time. Before we fast forward to what's next, I want to quickly kind of take us back in time, rewind a little bit, because this happening midweek, we saw at that event in the White House, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, handing the note. We saw Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. Talk about the characters, the other players in this that made this come together. How instrumental were Rubio, Witkoff, Kushner to actually getting this phase one done?
Well, I think everybody played an important role, and they really did feel like there was a sense of urgency here. I mean, the White House has spoken about how when Witkoff and Kushner landed on the ground, they really felt a sense of urgency and worked through the night immediately upon landing and didn't even go to the hotel because they really felt like Hamas was in a situation where they were willing to give up the hostages and sort of seeing the hostages not as bargaining chips, but really as a liability. And the U.S. negotiators were willing to sort of strike while the iron was hot on that regard. I was at that event at the White House. It was an Antifa event about with the influencers talking about Antifa in the United States. Rubio turned up and was like visibly anxious and ready for the president to stop taking questions from reporters and to leave the event so they could post a message about the potential deal. I think there is a lot of optimism and a lot of sort of excitement among the administration, and it's taken a lot of work to sort of get here. But again, I do want to just caution that there's still a long way to go before it's over.
And can we talk about the relationship between President Trump and Netanyahu, obviously welcoming him there to the Knesset, and obviously his point, his place in Israel beyond this was still very much in question. He's visited 4 times during President Trump. What's the interaction going to be like between him and Trump there as he welcomes them to Israel?
I think it will be positive. I don't want to sort of sound like a broken record, but I mean, I think that this is really very much one of the reasons why the president moved so quickly to make this trip happen. Presidents often can't turn around trips, especially, into this part of the world as quickly as this one has come together. But I do think that they really want to sort of seize a moment that they see as momentum. Netanyahu's position is interesting domestically. I mean, his coalition was a little bit fragile. There's some people that are really frustrated with him. And, I actually asked the president about Netanyahu's future during the cabinet meeting, and he sort of said, I don't know, we'll see. He thought it would be positive, but he also wasn't sort of willing to bet how domestic Israeli politics would go. I do think it's a much safer bet that Netanyahu and President Trump have, had a very strong relationship, and that this will probably, strengthen it, at least for the time being.
Yeah, and as we talk about, I just wanted to ask your point because we've seen Netanyahu be so present there in front of the American public in the White House several times during his trip. I do want to ask you about, obviously, we're talking about this phase one, the fragileness of it, but also needs to be accountability. And the United States at the forefront of this, President Trump kind of on the board of this task force, so to speak. In terms of this, what is the U.S. involvement? We know some 200 troops potentially involved there, not necessarily boots on the ground, but they will be present. Can you talk about the U.S.'s influence in making sure that both parties take account for this deal?
Right. Well, I think that's an excellent question, frankly. There will be, you mentioned the 200 troops, but the president and the administration has also been very clear in saying there will not be boots on the ground in Gaza, right? So what are those 200 troops going to do? What role are they going to play in the sort of the international peacekeeping, coalition? What's that coalition going to look like, right? How many countries are going to contribute to it? What role will they play? All of these things are things we really don't know. And, we can't really talk about, frankly, until we get through the sort of the initial stage, right? If we fail in phase one, the international force may not be set up and, and we won't know what it looks like, right? But I guess I think that the administration has to sort of thread a needle here because there isn't any interest, I think, domestically in deploying U.S. troops, U.S. forces to Gaza, but the U.S. wants to be very seen as instrumental in sort of moving this process forward. So that's why you get things like 200 troops involved on some level, even if they're not on the ground. And you also have, President Trump is, he's said several times, I'm a busy guy, but I'm going to make time. I'm going to be on this, board, making sure that the coalition sort of functions correctly. He is a busy guy, right? And he's got a lot going on. There's a lot on his plate. It's hard to imagine that he's going to be able to run sort of a very complicated, like mini NATO, right? Or whatever this looks like when it's ready to go. But his sort of willingness to say that he's going to do that, I think speaks to just how important this is to the administration, and how optimistic they are about it potentially lasting.
Yeah, and accountability, obviously, there's just so many somewhat wild cards, so to speak, in terms of how this comes together. And, of course, making sure both sides are living by this deal. I do want to ask you in terms of what comes next, because there's so much talk about a two-state solution. They kind of pushed that down the road. We saw at the United Nations, the 80th General Assembly, Israel, the United States, they weren't present as they were kind of talking about more nations recognizing a state of Palestine. Will that be ignored during this time? I know you're probably not most favorable to mention it during the Knesset, but will that be a point of conversation about what happens next? And is that going to be something they discuss in phase 2, 3, or 4?
That's hard to know. I obviously this is not a question that the president has wanted to answer sort of very directly. It's been put to him a couple different times when I was in the room and when several reporters put it to him, and he's sort of non-committal about it, right? Because it's a very, very precarious sort of issue. I don't expect that it would come up in his formal remarks, but I do think he will probably be asked about it on the ground whenever the press gets a chance to be close to him. And as you mentioned, he may speak on the plane going over there, and this will certainly be a topic of conversation. I don't know. The long-time U.S. policy was, eventually working towards two-state solution. The president has been, much less sort of excited about that. But that is certainly going to have to be a topic, especially if you're talking about sort of lasting peace in the region. There's no way to get there without, broaching this subject. So I think the President Trump is going to sort of get through the next, quick trip to Israel without talking about it as much as he can, but he can't hide from it forever.
Yeah, and that was part of the 20-point position in terms of their plan that Hamas can't be a part of that governing body potentially in Palestine. So that's very interesting. All right, well, before I let you go, I do want to talk because you mentioned there are plenty of other things that he has his finger on in terms of the polls. This coming in about China and tariffs, as this happened on Friday, as he talked about they will now impose a 100% tariff over and above any tariff that they're currently paying. Also, November 1st, we will impose export controls on all their critical software. That coming several days ago. This response coming in just here over the weekend from President Trump here on LiveNOW from Fox saying, don't worry, China, it will be all fine. Highly respected. President Xi just had a bad moment. He doesn't want depression for his country. Neither do I. The U.S. wants to help China, not hurt it. Well, this is a kind of a back and forth scenario. We're talking about a trade war reinitiated on a Friday, and by Monday, it could be all gone. Where do we stand at this moment?
Well, I think that tweet might have been the president reacting to the markets, right? I mean, there was a major shift downward after his tweet on Friday suggesting that his truth on Friday suggesting that there was going to be a strong retaliation. And now he's sort of saying, "Don't worry, I get along well with Xi. Don't sell your stock. Don't put us back in a hole in terms of the markets." But the other interesting thing is China today came out and basically said, "Look, we don't want a trade war. We don't want to do this back and forth. We want to negotiate. That's always been our position." So the other thing about President Trump, obviously, he loves to be the deal maker. There's still time and space to basically negotiate, and I think that this statement sort of gets us closer to a situation where China and the U.S. can keep talking, as opposed to simply, the sort of line in the sand moment on Friday when he said, "Look, they're going to have big tariffs because I'm tired of the China not keeping its word on rare earths." So, obviously this is an issue that will continue. It will be ongoing. But I do think that it just shows that there's more at work here. I mean, the tariffs are important, and the Chinese response and the president's response are important, but these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? I mean, we do have the stock market, and we have all sorts of global demand, and those are greatly affected, as we saw by every little sort of wiggle on this. So it's not something that can be easily explained in an afternoon.
Yeah, and obviously the market's reacting in a bad way on Friday. They could be booming on Monday morning. So we'll see kind of what the response is in terms of that. Just to give your perspective, because we talk about China, that was the initial kind of point of for President Trump in terms of lots of these tariffs, and we trade so much imports, exports with China. They're the main player in this, and if it goes sour with China, it could have a ripple effect down the line, correct?
It certainly could. Yeah, absolutely. And, and China is a supplier, not just the United States, but so many different components to so many different things in the world, right? So any sort of back and forth with the U.S. that raises prices is going to really have a global impact. And it's not just on the U.S. market. It's really on the world market. But, the president knows that, and certainly Beijing knows that as well. And I don't think that either side necessarily wants to get into sort of an escalation if it sort of is unnecessary, right, or without provocation, let's say. And so what we saw on Friday was sort of Trump voicing his displeasure. Now he's saying maybe they can work it out. That's also part of this whole sort of negotiation process. But this certainly is more than just the U.S. and Chinese effect. This is really a global phenomenon.
And if maybe whatever was said on Friday, the 100% tariffs, he said it was kind of sinister from China, and he walked it back slightly on Sunday. But if we're back to 100% tariffs, that's going to have a huge impact on the market, on businesses. How will that kind of influence some of this? If that happens, will Americans feel it pretty soon?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was originally with the tariff threats that started, in the spring, a lot of producers and manufacturers sort of stockpiled, raw materials and cranked out sort of extra production to try and sort of, head off the tariffs. In the months that followed, a lot of those supplies have sort of dwindled, right? And they've been used up, and there were already some sort of headwinds in terms of rising unemployment in the economy. So the economy might have been headed for a slowdown anyway. If the tariffs take effect, it could certainly, sort of complicate matters on that front. But I think we should be clear, the 100% tariffs have been sort of suspended by both sides while they continue to negotiate. And, what the president was sort of angry about was rare earth minerals, which of course are important for smartphones and all sorts of technological, pieces of equipment that really sort of are vital to our way of life now. But he's not suggesting that neither side, I guess, is suggesting they go back to 100% tariffs immediately on all goods. If they were to do that, I do think you would see a reaction in the market, and I think it would be probably, sooner rather than later that it would be felt by consumers as well.
I'm glad you brought up the timing of it, because it's interesting. You mentioned this stockpile of kind of goods that people brought over in anticipation for the tariffs. Now with 2026, just months down the road. Companies probably don't have that option if this happens. So very interesting. Well, my last question before I let you go, because obviously there's not enough to talk about in terms of everything going on in Washington, D.C. We are in a government shutdown, day number 12, 11 days, 16 hours into this. Lots of conversation about federal workers not getting paid, layoffs on the horizon. I know you're familiar with, obviously, the military and the ability of them not getting paid. Where do we stand right now? How important is it to the Trump administration, to Congress, to at least get military members paid until federal workers can get back pay when this is over?
Right. Well, there are a lot of folks, of federal employees and members of the military that are looking at potentially missing a paycheck, starting either last Friday or in the next couple of days. And one of the things the administration has done over the weekend is announced that they plan to take money that was sort of, earmarked for research and divert it to members of the military to make sure that they don't, miss paychecks. I think the goal of keeping the nation's military paid is probably a bipartisan one, frankly, right? I mean, both sides are blaming each other for the shutdown, but I don't think anybody sort of wants to see military, people serving their country not get paid. But this is obviously a stopgap measure. That money was allocated, and in some cases is even, spelled out in law that it needs to be spent on one thing. Spending it on another thing temporarily can probably work, but it will raise all sorts of legal questions. And it's not going to be a fix forever. Now, that said, I don't really cover Congress, but I don't see any sort of breakthroughs that would suggest that we're any closer to ending a shutdown now than we were, when it started. I think both sides think they're sort of winning the public opinion, fallout on this, and they're not necessarily very willing to sort of back down on their positions right now. And that means the government will, likely stay shut down, at least in the short term, and that in terms of pet projects to the administration and other things important to both sides, like getting, military personnel paid, they're going to have to get creative with how they do it, at least, for now.
Yeah, and we know that Congress is the one that allocates, that appropriates all of those funds. And we know, and you mentioned, it's a bipartisan. I think nobody really wants to not see the military get paid if you're serving the country, if you're defending the country in that way. But just the legal gray area, is there something that the Trump administration is wary about, that there might be some legal remedies to this that's saying, hey, you can't use those funds for that reason?
Yeah, I mean, this was something they've just announced, and so I don't think, obviously they're going to do it, regardless of whether or not it turns out to be legal. And I'm not sure, if lawsuits will be filed, but I do think that's a very good question going forward. I mean, we do have statutory appropriations, right, that come from Congress, not from the executive branch. So anything that's done would have to sort of be temporary and for stopgap purposes. And the longer this goes on, the more pressure points these things have, that there will be. And missing paychecks, of course, is very, very important. But having the government shut down has all sorts of effects in every state. It's not just here in Washington. It's all kinds of programs everywhere. And how long it will go, I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah, how long it will go and how many people be out of a job permanently. That's also a big question. All right, Will, thank you so much for breaking it all down. I appreciate you. A lot to cover there in our nation's capital, covering the White House, covering the Trump administration. But thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks so much. All right, great conversation as always, as we just did watch President Trump go wheels up to the Middle East to celebrate that phase one of a peace deal between Israel and Hamas. We're expecting hostages to be released early on Monday as President Trump arrives in Tel Aviv, expected to speak to the Knesset. I'm Andy Mack. We're back.